All right. Thank you all for joining us today. We're excited to share this conversation to you on a very important topic, confidence and resiliency in a third-party vendor program. Our goal today is to walk away with how to measure your program's true maturity of TPRM capabilities, so third-party risk management capabilities, strategies on how to help best identify the types of risk within your third-party vendor relationships, and then tactics on how you can build resiliency within your third-party vendor relationships and programs, and how tools and capabilities kind of measure up in there. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Anir Desai. I'm a senior manager here at Tevora. I oversee our strategic services tower, which includes enterprise risk management, privacy management, and third-party risk management. Tevora is a cybersecurity compliance and CISO support consultancy centered around helping security leaders implement strategies that make sense for their businesses. Before we get started, I'd like to ask our two panelists to give a brief introduction. Jeremiah, do you want us to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. So hello, everyone. My name is Jeremiah Solberg. I'm one of the principals over here at Tevora on the delivery side. Our teams are collectively responsible for our federal, our healthcare, the services under Anir, and our virtual CISO services. Just as a little bit of a background, I've been a CISO in the past, and also have had third-party vendor management programs roll up underneath me for Fortune 100 sized organizations. So this is something that's very near and dear to my heart, and I've earned a lot of scars over the years in this space. So happy to share some of my stories, recommendations, and vision of where programs are evolving towards and where they need to go next.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeremiah. Jonathan?
And Jeremiah, I think I'd probably share some of those same scars. My name is John Arrett. I'm the VP of Business Enablement for the RiskRecon product here at MasterCard. I've been in this space since 2004, about 20 years as a practitioner. Had the great pleasure to work in some companies like Royal Bank of Scotland and HSBC Bank. Most recently built and ran third-party risk for one of the Blue Cross Blue Shield companies, and was co-founder and president of an international nonprofit called the Third-Party Risk Association. So pretty much a one-trick pony. Been in third-party risk for basically my entire career, aside from some time spent as a Lotus Notes administrator at IBM, which half people on this call have probably never heard of. But hey, everybody's got to start somewhere out of college. But really excited to be here and talk about third-party risk. I've had the pleasure of meeting Jeremiah in person a couple months ago. So I think we're going to have a great discussion. Really looking forward to being a part of this. And thanks to Tevora for bringing RiskRecon and myself in to talk. So looking forward to today.
Perfect. Thank you both. Appreciate it. Just for our audience members here, before we get started, just know that if you have any questions for the two panelists here today, you can enter them into the Q&A box below, and I'll do my best to get to it and present them to the folks here. So just an example out of that, I do want to do a poll question just to get us warmed up here. I have a poll question for you all that'll get released here. What is your morning beverage of choice? So there's a few options. There's Starbucks, Dunkin', tea, water. There's something else. If you prefer a local coffee shop as well, please throw that in there. We'd love to hear your responses.
I don't know. For me, I'm a Starbucks fan, but folks like to make fun of me about that too. So I don't know. Especially when I go up into the Northeast, I think that's Dunkin' turf up there. How about Buffalo? What are they typically drinking up there, John?
Well, I'm one of those very people that doesn't drink coffee.
What?
I just green tea. What my wife thinks there's something wrong with me, but in the Buffalo area, because we're basically Canada South, Tim Hortons is the primary, and then if you like the exclusive stuff, you go to Starbucks, like my teenagers who want the $7 caramel macchiato and all that stuff, and I'm forced to pay it.
Gotcha. Fantastic.
All right. Well, looks like the results are in, and Jeremiah, I think you still win 35% Starbucks.
Starbucks is, yeah. I don't go to the actual Starbucks shop. I do buy it in the bag because I'm cheap at heart, but we do have it on the counter at home. Thanks for getting everyone warmed up here with the polls there, Anir.
Absolutely, not a problem. Well, we have some I've curated some good questions for you both in terms of the industry and what I see out there as a practitioner, and similar to what you both face on a daily basis as well. But before I dive into the question, John, do you want to give us an overview of RiskRecon just for the audiences here?
Sure. For those of you who aren't familiar with our product, we're essentially a continuous monitoring cyber risk ratings platform. We're looking at things from the outside looking in. There's some other tools in this space. We like to think we're a little bit different in the way we do things, as we actually build about 95% of our own data, aside from buying a small amount of data from places like Shodan. Accuracy is paramount to what we do. And oddly enough, we were acquired by MasterCard about 4.5 years ago, which when people talk to me and ask what that's like, it's basically like being little orphan Annie and getting adopted by Daddy Warbucks. So funding is no longer a problem, but it's there's a lot more lawyers telling me what I can and can't do. But yeah, so we operate in that space. Our founder, Kelly White, was a former CISO himself and was looking to solve a problem, and built the tool because he couldn't find a tool that did what he wanted to do. And the rest is sort of history.
Gotcha. Sounds good. Thank you. So I have one more poll question just for the audience here. In terms of numbers of third-party vendors, if you had to guess, how many vendors does your organization currently utilize? There's some choices here: less than 10, between 10 and 50, 50 to 100, 100 plus, or you truly just don't know. So the poll questions should be on your screens now.
Yeah, that's just it's how many do you think you have, and then how many do you really have?
Right. I was gonna say the honest answer really should be I just don't know, because I don't think anybody ever has a full picture of it, but we'll see.
Absolutely. That goes into an interesting story. I was working with a client probably 15 years ago, and they were sure they only had about 30 vendors. And lo and behold, after some digging, some surveying, and some other, investigations, it was like 10 times that number, and they were floored. But yeah, it's what you don't know is what is really scary sometimes.
Yep.
We'll see what everyone else thinks here.
All right. So the results are in, and the winner here is 100 plus. So less than 10, 5%, between 10 and 50, 21%, 50 to 100, 11%, 100 plus, 47. And then I have no idea, 16. So still up there.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you to our participants here. I'll get started with questions here. So my first question, I'm going to start with Jeremiah on the services side, and then I'm going to transition over to John on the product side and the tool side. So since identification is such a pivotal part in third-party risk management, right? So I guess I'll start with, what are some initial steps an organization can take in identifying risks in their vendor relationships?
Gotcha. Great question. Well, I think before, kind of almost jumping off of the poll we just did, before we even identify the risks with the vendors themselves, is identifying how many vendors do we have. That's probably the biggest thing that I see in organizations. And a lot of times when we're working with CISOs, and sometimes it's folks underneath the IT group, they're always talking number of IT vendors or security vendors that they have. But the businesses are a lot bigger than that. You've got HRIS systems, you got systems in business side and sales side, where maybe customer support. So it's not just the security partners, it's not just the IT partners, but there's lots of vendors out there that may be very instrumental to an organization. So I would really say the first risk is to identify, make sure you've got visibility to look at what your entire vendor ecosystem is. And I always call that the denominator. So I always ask vendors, what's that denominator number that you're looking at, and how many fall into different categories from there. But some of the strategies to help make sure you understand your denominator, how many vendors you have out there, is to, there's obvious ones. How many people do I pay? Or go to accounts, payable. If we're paying them, we should certainly have them on a list that we're watching to evaluate what the potential impact is. The next one would be, hey, do we have a contract in place with them? That's kind of an easy one, that those two are typically the starting points for organization. But then it gets into some other ones. There's vendors that are maybe they're freemium services, things that end users can click through and agree to the terms of use. And so there's a couple different ways to kind of capture that denominator. For me, you can do surveys that are out there. You can look at network traffic. A lot of platforms and tools, Zscalers and others, have some really good insights as to where data is going, and you can use that as a network insight to figure out, hey, where's my users going and pushing information. Like I mentioned before, the survey angle, and then just kind of also looking at the personal cards and expenses. So it's funny. You have folks that will have a very low cost service. Maybe it's $5 a month, $10 a month. That's using this third-party service. It's so cheap that they're expensing it on their personal corporate card or sending it through an expense reporting system. So there's not a contract in place. Accounts payable is not paying for it, but there is still that insights. So it's really digging into your organization's nooks and crannies to find out, hey, what is that denominator to figure out what are all the vendors there. Then to actually talk about what are some of the risks is you're not going to be able to have the risk is you don't have enough resources. You don't have time. You're not going to be able to treat all vendors the same. And so the next big risk that I would say that I see in organizations is not taking a risk-based approach in sense of, hey, what are the ones that are the highest priority to me? What are my characterization details that I say this is someone that's a higher priority versus another, medium priority versus a low priority. Yes, coffee is very important to organizations, but I wouldn't put Starbucks, even though we spend money with Starbucks, as a top tier vendor. So having a tiering process that allows us to, prioritize the limited, time, resources, and money that organizations have is the next biggest risk, is not planning for what makes the most sense. So to me, it's figuring out the denominator and then prioritizing through a tiering model and approach and customizing that for an organization to make the best use of their total resources.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Thank you, Jeremiah. Yeah, that covers the process front and a lot of process related items there in your response there. John, I want to get your take in terms of tools, right? How can a tool like RiskRecon help with the identification and awareness and some of the components that Jeremiah was talking about from the process front?
Sure. First of all, I want to say, Jeremiah, you hit on some gold there, right? And it's kind of timely that we're talking about coffee because my advice on top of what Jeremiah said is get used to buying lots of cups of coffee, right? Because you're gonna be talking to a lot of business units and explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, to try and vet out all of those vendors that you don't know about. And if you come with a nice cup of coffee, you generally get a more responsive person. And I have lived that. Hey, we're paying a vendor on a corporate card thing. I was part of a bank that acquired somebody who we had hundreds of vendors that were being paid and hosted on like bluehost.com or oneandone.com and $4 a month and collecting PII and all sorts of great information that we found out after the acquisition. So there is no shortage of rocks that you will overturn and find little bugs scurrying out from, and those are your vendors. From a tool perspective, I'm going to kind of speak from it from the standpoint of, especially from a RiskRecon standpoint of, okay, we've identified some swath of vendors, right? We've gone through Jeremiah's portion of the exercise. We have now this gigantic list of vendors, and we don't honestly know what to do with them quite yet. We probably haven't had the time to run an inherent risk rating methodology through all of them because that takes time. And Lord knows TPRM teams are never overstaffed. We're always understaffed, right? So where we've seen things, or we've seen customers use RiskRecon, and not even for like newly starting programs, but sometimes for programs where they just have tens or hundreds of thousands of vendors and they just don't have the ability to have eyes on everything, is to take that list of vendors and dump them into the system where you're at least getting some cursory security posture information about that vendor. So if I don't know exactly what the vendor does for me yet, I want to focus on the companies that I can see that really don't have a very good cyber posture, right? Because those present at least some risk to me. And then where we've seen this work really well is put that list into the tool, get that kind of tiering of good vendors, bad vendors, really bad vendors, and then take the really bad ones, focus on, okay, now what do they do for me? Let me see if this is a really a risk for me and start to tranche them out. Because you can't boil the ocean as a third-party risk practitioner. Chances are, if you're starting a program, it's probably you, maybe you and one other person, and you're trying to assess 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 vendors. I've lived that life. It's not easy. It's not fun, and you never have enough resources to do all this. So, kind of going spot on to what Jeremiah said is kind of acting where the risks are. Like, if we know that there's some cyber risk, let's at least start to figure out what those companies do. Let's reach out to the business. Let's put those vendors through the inherent risk assessment, see if something we really need to be concerned about, or, okay, those really, just happens to be that the water guy has really bad cyber posture, right? We don't need to worry about that. Let's move on. But I will add one thing, and this was a kind of a motto that I always lived by when I ran my programs, was I never approved vendors. I approved relationships. So everything that Jeremiah said, do that on a per relationship level, because you could have a company like IBM where it knows you're probably doing 60, 70 different deals with them, and they present so many different levels of risk. And if you assess them at just, one level, you're going to miss that other things are potentially much higher. Or you approve a printing vendor to print marketing material. 6 months later, somebody decides they want to send a bunch of PHI and PII to them because you approved the vendor. Quickly that gets out of, what you had things under control in the beginning, and now they're quickly drifting away from you. So yeah, we see customers pour the data into the tool and then use that to kind of tranche their vendors and decide who I want to tackle first when I'm just getting started, because you can't boil the ocean.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And yeah, I personally love that about RiskRecon is I don't have to talk to anybody, and I can get my data via just typing in the vendor name and getting the output of their security posture. So yeah, thank you for that.
It's like the security guy's dream. Nobody ever wants to talk to the vendor, right? You just want the data.
I don't have to send an email. I know what I need to do, and I can hone in. If I see something fishy, I can reach out. So now going back to our poll question, right? I think one of the poll questions highlighted to us that organizations have 100, at least our audience members here have 100 plus vendor, right? So sometimes they have 100, sometimes if not thousands, depending on the industry, and each can pose a different kind of risk. So utilizing RiskRecon, how can you ensure that you're not overlooking some of the less obvious types of risks?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of going back to what I said, is putting all the vendors in the tool and then kind of monitoring that. And risk isn't static, right? Risk changes on a daily basis. You do your security questionnaire once a year. I kind of liken that to taking my car to the mechanic and getting my inspection done, right? They look at the brakes, they look at the tires, they look at the lights, and they bless it, and I go out the door and I drive that car for another year. Well, a lot happens in that year between the next inspection, right? Maybe I don't pay my insurance, maybe I don't change my brakes or anything like that, and there's all these risks that pop up. So it's more about keeping tabs on risks as it currently stands and what you need to address at any given point in time. And I would caution, I think, kind of to deviate a little bit from the question, but I would say, I think one of the sins that we've had in third-party risk for the longest time is that a lot of programs focus on just who has my data, right? They look at the confidentiality risk, the C piece of the CIA triad. But if you really look at the rest of the triad, I think for me, availability these days is probably a much bigger risk, the resiliency aspect. And that brings in a whole new level of vendors that you maybe want to monitor, right? Maybe initially you were just looking at, like Jeremiah said, a lot of companies say, well, these are just my technology vendors. Well, there's vendors that provide software that is critical to, money transfer. They don't have any of your data, but you run it in-house. If they get breached and they push down malicious code into your system, well, that's a challenge. Or it's a critical supplier that, no data, but maybe if they have a ransomware event, suddenly you're not making money on, from what you do with them. So I think being able to have that situational awareness, which usually comes via a tool, right? Because you can't do it all just on spreadsheets. The situational awareness allows you to see what's going on at a given point in time and address risk as it happens.
I'm going to build on what you just said there, John.
Yeah.
I think it was UniSuper, that entity down in Australia that had everything deployed on the Google Cloud platform. They had done a configuration change to their master account, and in that process, it had deleted all of the data within their Google Cloud. And they had, fortunately, very fortunately, they had a backup. Otherwise, it was $135 billion in pension fund information that instantly evaporated. So when you're looking at your, resiliency in the third parties, they'll say, all right, where are my vendors on, and where are my third parties? Where are my fourth parties? And are they all on the same platform? And by having that landscape, does that give me visibility into where my potential overarching risks are as an organization? How leveraged are we on maybe AWS in an East region weapons if that goes down? Or do we have to have multi-region availability? Every year, whether or not AWS or Azure or Google Cloud has a snafu for a couple hours or a day, but that happens. And at some point, we've started to accept that risk, which is kind of interesting, but not all businesses are as tolerant. Look at, Delta Airlines with, CrowdStrike. How impacted were they? Are they, what's the resiliency there with, using a tool like them? So I think that getting that landscape allows you to have a different analytical view of the vendors that you're using. So to your point, I think you get that bigger, wider breadth and saying, hey, are we exposed in new and different ways? So I'm really about understanding your landscape. I think that's
the fourth party piece that you brought up is spot on. Actually, I have a real world example. Early on in my career, I worked in a bank, in a network operations center. We had, what everybody does. We had redundant paths of fiber. They were going through different carriers, all sorts of stuff. We thought we were good. Then somebody has a car accident in Baltimore in one of the tunnels, and there's a fire, and it burns through all the fiber in the tunnel. Come to find out, both of our fiber paths went through the exact same tunnel. And they went out, they're east and west, different directions, but they all met in the same place. And that was that concentration risk that we did not know about. And that presented a huge problem, right? So it's understanding that landscape and who's using what and how it interacts and how it affects you.
Okay. I'm going to pivot to maturity and metrics here, and then I'll come back to the resiliency aspect, and then I'll bring in some of the CrowdStrike related items that occurred recently as well. So I'll start with Jeremiah first. When it comes to evaluating maturity of a program, right? What has been your experience in measuring the third-party risk management maturity? So, for example, if I haven't done it in a while, or I'm newly in charge of a vendor management program, what are some initial steps that I should take as a program manager to identify what's the maturity of my program as it stands?
Great question. And maturity is something that is dynamic over time. What was mature 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly doesn't meet the mark today, and what meets the mark going forward to tomorrow. So definitely take this, view as a point in time that maturity is an evolutionary target to reach. But first, we talked about that, vendor landscape, understanding the ability to, know where all your vendors are. That's a huge maturity step. Getting beyond just the accounts, payable and your contracts inventory. That's a maturing step for vendor identification. As far as, how does the program work in maturing? One of the things that I found is a huge maturing step in organizations. And John touched on this a little bit earlier, is, having conversations with your adjacent business units. So cybersecurity should be talking with legal, that should be talking to procurement, and getting some good harmonization there. So for me, one of the things that is a maturing step is we see this disparate problem that exists, that the legal team has one set of expectations in a contract. They'll have their security addendums that, these must be put out there. And then you'll have these third-party questionnaires that are created by the security team that says, this is what's really important to us. And then you'll actually have the team that does the assessments against the third parties, and they'll have a different set of criteria. And so for me, getting harmonization between what's in the contract, what's actually asked during a security questionnaire, what's actually audited against, and having those things harmonized creates a maturity step for you as an organization that allows you to be more efficient with your time. And so there's an efficiency there. Measuring the maturity of your own metrics and your own process documents. We go into some clients and we do these maturity assessments. And one of the things that we often find is, okay, show us your documentation, how the process happens. And a lot of times it's very thin, or, hey, here's the spreadsheet I send out. Well, what happens if they don't fill everything out? And so that decision criteria is when a vendor fills out a questionnaire and there is not favorable answers. I've seen one that says, do you have an information security policy? No. Do you have endpoint security? No. Do you have secure development? No. It's like, okay. And now that we have these unfavorable results that come back from a questionnaire, what do you do with them? And we say, well, we raise them as risks and just pass them on to business. It's like, well, okay, that absolutely businesses should have the authority to have a risk-based approach to, onboard these vendors, but do you have some guidance? What's your recommendation? So I think there's some programmatic documentation that needs to exist. For me, that's a maturity step. And then lastly, that metrics piece that I started to talk about is, what kind of metrics are you measuring? And I know that's something that you want to touch on a little bit later, but metrics is how well are you running the programs? How efficient are your teams? How efficient are your responses? Where's the friction in the process? And being able to get into some pinpoints to reduce friction and make the process suck less for all involved parties. That's where I see maturity happening, is that evolutionary, iterative process to keep making it smoother and smoother, and using continuous monitoring tools. There is, like John said, a point in time assessment and then continuous monitoring, just like your FedRAMP audits. Hey, there's an annual requirement and continuous monitoring that happens throughout the year. Continuous monitoring needs to be a maturing point to be able to take action between those annual review cycles.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep my response to that maybe a little bit more basic, right? Because I agree with everything Jeremiah said. If you're just taking over a program, the question I'd ask is, do I even have a program, right? And I like to, people get all flustered when someone asks them to start a third-party risk program. They have no clue what they're doing. A great way to find out how mature your program is, if you really don't know, is to go get involved, right? There's lots of organizations out there that deal in third-party risk, and third-party risk people never get talked to. They're like the stepchild you lock under the stairs and you never see the day, like they see daylight maybe 1 hour a day when it comes to the security space. And go meet some people, go on LinkedIn, talk to people, and find out what they're doing. Because people in this space, like, they love to share what they're doing. And if you're just getting started, hey, it's like the saying, the slowest person in a marathon is still faster than the person that's sitting on the couch. So if you're just getting started, that's right there, you're already more mature than a lot of people in this space that just don't put any effort into it. I've met people that say that their third-party risk program is just to do business with people that they've done business with in the past. Kind of some flawed thinking in there sometimes. But from a tool perspective, I've seen a lot of companies where they build out a program, some policies and procedures, or maybe using an Excel spreadsheet when they first get started, and then you start to realize, hey, that isn't enough. I need to start to have that continuous look at what's going on. Nothing is, like I said before, nothing is static in this space. Things change on a day-to-day basis. So, the more mature programs start to use tools like RiskRecon to pull in data, keep a continuous look at what's going on, and go from there.
Got it. Okay. Thank you both. I think you guys both collectively answered my next question. So I'm going to jump into resiliency here just for a little bit. So given the recent CrowdStrike incident, right? Not an incident, but an event, but contingency and resiliency plans kind of came to the forefront for most organizations that we interact with that were able to recover quickly, and then those that weren't able to recover quickly. How can an organization develop effective contingency plans with their vendors and obtain their buy-in on that contingency plan, so that way, when something like this happens, they know who's accountable and where to kind of get information from?
I got a couple thoughts on this. Let me start off by saying, you have to set expectations at the beginning of any relationship. And this is something I've said for many years. I'm fortunate to be happily married for 22 years, I think, 23.
It's the real test now, Jeremiah.
Let me look on the inside of my ring here. 23 years. And it starts with communication. And that extends into business relationships and having effective communication, setting expectations up front. And those expectations are part of, when you do those onboarding questionnaires, when you write your contracts, you want to make sure you're collecting the right kind of information. A lot of the contracts should have, hey, in case of an incident, you need to reach out to this, or incidents need to be reported to us on this, and take that information and not just have that in a contract, but have that in an accessible, quickly accessible form, so that when incidents happen, you know who to reach out to. When there's big security issues out there, or vulnerabilities, Log4j's and others that affect multiple vendors, you need to know, hey, who are all my vendors? Let's find out if they're affected by this. And so being able to have the right kind of point of contact information, who to reach out to, escalation information in quickly retrievable format is something that helps your organization be more resilient to those events. So data organization, it's funny, we talk about all this, comes back down to just having organized data. Good business processes certainly solves many of those challenges, but it's making sure you're organizing the right kind of data. So you set those expectations up front, have clauses and contracts that establish what is escalations, how escalations happen, catalog that information in systems, make it so it's easily retrievable. And this is something that actually starts to tie into something else that's not centered here, but one of our clients recently asked us to do a tabletop exercise, and one of the vectors that we do these models around with these tabletop exercises. Okay, when your clients are breached, or there's this new vulnerability, we don't know how many vendors. How do you access that information? Being able to tap into your third-party vendor management systems and being able to pull out the right kind of information in a timely fashion is ever so critical. So I would say start with those things: contracts, contact management information, centralizing your information, and then being able to test yourself of being able to access that as staff changes in organizations. Does the new person know where this information is? So that ongoing testing is very critical. So that's where I'd start. And having the business continuity, I'd say, just to wrap up on that point, is when you are having conversations about your vendors and what they do for you, do I need more than one vendor that can solve this problem? I see this problem from two different aspects. One, when we see that go through these third-party vendor reviews, it's like, man, this is the fifth vendor that this organization that does the exact same thing. Boy, it's like, maybe they can save some money in procurement by going ahead and consolidating and everyone using one vendor instead of having 6 different vendors that all happen to have something very, very similar. But conversely is that, hey, are we overly focused? Kind of like we talked about at the beginning, that we just have this one vendor. Do we have the ability to have another vendor that does something similar that we can fail over into? So I hate harping on the conversation, just knowing your vendor landscape, but that's ever important. And then having the conversations with the business who are sponsoring those, because some really interesting insights when you start to look at your own data.
Yeah, Jeremiah, your example, or talking about the marriage, I think is really applicable here, right? If you and I've been married 21 years. If I never talked to my wife after our wedding day, what kind of relationship would we have, right? It takes a lot of work to stay married for 20 plus years, let me tell you. And that's the same thing with vendor relationships. It's not about hey, I've onboarded them, I don't have that ongoing dialogue. It's the QBRs and the constant refresh of information, all the onboarding material you got, making sure it's consistently up to date, that things don't change. And then when something goes bump in the night, having the ability to find out, how does this impact my vendor landscape, right? Because that's the worst call you get as a third-party risk practitioner, when the CISO knocks on your door and says, hey, something hit the fan. How does it impact our vendors? And if you don't have a good answer, it's a really tough day, or it's a really long couple weeks trying to send out questionnaires to get responses to them. And having the right tools in place that can kind of at least give you a cheat code and give you some idea as to who might be using this piece of software to address, that really makes life a lot easier. But yeah, it's a relationship, right? It's with your vendor. They got to be bought in. They need to be a part of all the testing you do and all that stuff. And you need to know what they do for you to make sure that you're not running blind in that as well.
Got it. Okay. John, I have a question for you. So I want to give some love to our smaller organizations. that are usually limited on resources. How can a tool like RiskRecon and the automation capabilities enable the smaller organizations to kind of stay up to speed with their vendor security posture and then any risks that the vendor might present?
Sure. I'm gonna pivot a little bit and not say smaller organizations. I'm gonna say smaller teams, because I've
Okay.
seen
Yeah.
some really large organizations where like two people working, and I actually saw two people running a vendor list of 85,000. Like, how you just can't manage that. Like that's like Atlas trying to hold up the world, right? Or Sisyphus rolling the ball up the hill. I probably is a better example. Um, a tool like RiskRecon can, when you're trying to stay above water, still keep an eye on what's going on with the posture, deal with all the stuff that comes in on a day-to-day basis. There's a bunch of different things, use cases you can use. Obviously, you can monitor your vendors, keep tabs on what's going on, and pivot when there's risk. So I was actually RiskRecon customer number 8. So I was a user before I was an employee. And one of the greatest uses I used when I managed, it was two of us managing 5,000 vendors, was RFPs and things like that, right? The business comes to you and they want you to do this full security assessment on 10 vendors that, you're going to pick one and you're not going to do business with the other 9, and you're going to waste 90% of your time. You don't have the ability to do that. So, throw them into a tool like RiskRecon, get a very quick posture assessment, and then try to steer the business. I'll say steer because they never actually totally listen to you when you say, hey, don't pick these guys. But steer the pool of available vendors in that RFP to the business, so you can try and weed out those bad vendors before they get into the system. And then the vendors are really tough to fix once you've onboarded them and the contract signed and they've been paid. Oftentimes you're working against your own business unit who might want the vendor to succeed. And you're here, being the boy you cried wolf, or like raising all chicken little and the sky is falling. So yeah, you don't have to be a very mature organization to use a continuous monitoring tool. You can obviously throw the stuff in there. You can do the RFP stuff, or you can just monitor for breaches. We have customers that do that as well. They put their vendor list in, and then I just want to know when there's a breach in this populace of vendors. I don't have the ability to really do too much right now, but I want to know when something is going to make my day significantly worse. Maybe you go to Starbucks, you get that extra cup of coffee, spring for the espresso or something. It all comes back to caffeine at the end.
It does. I'm an Americano. Give me some espresso with a little bit of water and I'm good to
go. All right. I do see a few good questions that I've kind of queued up in our Q&A, so I do want to allow some time for that. But my question, or my last question to both of you, is TPRM is a very evolving space, right? As you guys know, what do you guys see evolving over the next few years when it comes to TPRM? Or how do you see TPRM evolving over the next few years? I'll start with Jeremiah first, from the services lens first.
I'd say it depends on the organization. Each organization has their own journey and what matures and changes. A lot of the compliance frameworks out there have started to put a stronger emphasis on supply chain management, third-party risk. Look at NIST 853, that's got supply chain risk as its own control family now. It's highlighted as such a important aspect of it. As far as I think that you see compliance driving, snapshots. So I think one of the things that we see that we do preach is that when you're building out your tiering models, using certifications as a way to ease the third-party questionnaire process a little bit. So, hey, if this entity has FedRAMP, if this entity has an ISO 27000, or this entity has a SOC, maybe that's, one of those is FedRAMP's good enough for your tier 1 vendors. Maybe a SOC's good enough for your tier 3 vendors. So I definitely see that shift, because there's so much compliance demand out there that compliance is being integrated into the third-party vendor management programs as an acceptable equivalency requirement. And really, we're already doing that today. A lot of organizations, hey, you're not going to go ask Amazon to fill out a security questionnaire. No, they're just going to point to the compliance portal that has all of their artifacts on all the different compliances they do. So I think that that's going to see tighter integration. It's going to make it a little bit messy, but organizations are going to have to map back against that. The other area that I definitely see some, maturing in, and we started to touch on it, is the, insights into fourth parties. I think that's an area that it's so easy. in this day and age for an organization to create a business, create a great looking website. You can create, services. You can load things into your cloud environments. You can, use some tools to create some really crafty web applications really, really quick. But the operations behind the scene may still be lacking. And so understanding where your third parties and what platforms your third parties are using is going to be ever critical, because sometimes it's hard to see and stop at that third party lens. The fourth party lens is going to be, I think, part of the new frontier out there.
For me, I hate to use this as an example, but I think AI is going to play some piece in this, right? Because of the fact that we don't have enough staff and businesses love vendors, right? It's like governments and taxes. They just keep adding them. So there's going to have to be some component where somebody eventually brings in AI to do this. And where I see that probably happening the most, and where I think third-party risk is hopefully going, is kind of moving away from static methodologies of my highs are every year, my mediums are every 2 years, my lows are every 3 years. There's a component of that I think at times we're guilty of in third-party risk, where sometimes it's just a waste of time, right? It's a waste of the vendor's time. It's a waste of your time. I remember assessing the same high-risk vendor 2 or 3 years in a row, and they were great every time. There was almost nothing ever wrong with them, but we had to go through the paces of it. There's the vendor fatigue is real. Like, for all the stuff that we're tired of from performing the assessments, they're getting hit from every angle, and it is a real issue for them. Eventually they may just push back, and then it's really tough to get any information. Where I want to hopefully see third-party risk going is getting more into the predictive capability of what is my risk at any given point in time, right? It's not just about, hey, these are like I said, the highs, the mediums, the lows, and this is the frequency I do them, but like at any given point in time, what vendor poses the biggest risk to me? Maybe it's not that high risk vendor who has awesome controls, very low residual risk. Maybe it's the medium risk vendor that you only see every 2 years, you don't really collect a lot of evidence from. And they're a much higher risk right now because of, hey, there's a current CVE that they have, it's exploitable, all sorts of stuff. And hey, there's a bunch of concentration risk with them as well. How does that factor in? I think third-party risk moves into more of a predictive point in time, and we've with the right tools, you can definitely aid that. We've done some research into, with our own scoring methodology, what the likelihood of an A-rated vendor versus an F-rated vendor to have a ransomware event or a breach event. Like, it's kind of common sense that the A's are better than the F's, but neither one of them is 100%. The A's aren't 100% secure. From a breach standpoint, I think it's 5% of A's still have a breach. So how do you factor that in along with everything else about the vendor, and bringing in other areas of risk that have nothing to do with cyber, financial risk, geopolitical risk, all that sort of stuff. And if you're one of those groups that's kind of being asked to do a bunch of stuff right now, if you're looking at financial risk and you're looking at cyber risk and some other stuff, financial risk can be a great indicator of what's to come in cyber risk. If that organization suddenly is having a lot of money problems and all that sort of stuff, you can expect that they're probably not going to get the funding for cyber down the road. So even though they may have a great posture right now, you've done an assessment, you've looked at continuous monitoring, everything you can is great. If their financial health is bad, expect that you're going to have a problem with them, and try and get ahead of the curve, right? Don't sit back and be reactive, but get ahead and try and work with them and find out, okay, exactly what's going on. Do we need to pivot to Jeremiah's point? We have 4 other vendors that do this service. Do we need to pivot business away from them? I think that's where third-party risk is going, kind of jumping out past just the checkpoint and really trying to be proactive and get ahead of the curve.
Got it. Understood. I know we have a lot of questions queued up in the chat. So if we don't get to your question and provide you an answer, we'll follow up after this webinar and get you an answer. But I have a good one for Jeremiah here. What are your thoughts on using external assessments, right? Your SOC 2, Type 2, ISO certifications, statement of applicabilities. How do you determine which vendors are okay to accept these documents rather than having them fill out a large questionnaire?
Great question. And that's something we do encourage, but it's making sure that the right certifications are for the right tier or right sensitivity or right criticality of that particular vendor. When I think of my top tier vendors, I'm typically thinking of someone who, do they hold my most sensitive data? Do they have access to my networks? Is an outage going to affect my business? If it's, and do they develop something that can inject code into my platforms? Do they have physical access to my premise? If they answer yes to those key red 5 questions, then they're probably going to be one of your top tier vendors. There's different evaluations, from a SOC to an ISO to a FedRAMP. I would, what's the right risk profile for the organization? But absolutely, if someone's been through a FedRAMP audit, that at a moderate or certainly at a high impact level, those things are really, in-depth evaluations. Why are you going to ask them all a subset of those questions? But I would caution the one thing I can see so very often is like, oh, well, we have an ISO certification here for our data center. We're giving you services over here that we see oftentimes folks trying to misuse from a scope perspective. SOC 2 for this, for maybe a tier 2 or tier 3 evaluation over here. It's like, no, let's make sure that those accredited reports are covering the scope of services being provided. But if so, then I think there's absolutely appetite, and I would encourage organizations, if they've been certified by a reputable organization, that's the whole purpose. You're trying to do the same thing. You're outsourcing it for free. Yes, take advantage of it.
Yeah, just to chime in there on what you said, Jeremiah, I've lived through that. I once got a high trust assessment that covered a laptop, a printer, and a file server that the company didn't even own anymore. And I do think that the favorite response of many vendors, especially when they're using AWS or Google or Azure or something, is just here's AWS's SOC 2. Okay, well, there's definitely some difference in who's responsible for what pieces there. And the one thing I would add is that at the end of the day, don't be afraid to take. Obviously the FedRAMP, and we're living through the FedRAMP, so I know just how in depth that is. They might be in my house right now, I'm not sure. But other things, if you maybe the SOC 2 isn't as comprehensive as what you need from your questionnaire, don't be afraid to say this is a great starting point. Like here's validated evidence, but there's still these other controls that I really want you to still answer. And go from there. Use that as like a piece of evidence to build off of, and you can trust it, right? Unless it's from Uncle Bob's SOC 2 company, and those are out there, so be aware of that. But if you can trust it, use it as a piece of evidence, either as the whole review or as a really good starting point, because the vendor will appreciate it. That's the whole reason why they paid for it, and why they're going through the whole process and the pain of getting that stuff done is to use it. I'm sure it's quite infuriating when they do all that and then they just say, "Well, I don't care about what that says. I want you to answer my questionnaire anyways."
Yeah, and from the reverse perspective, there's we help organizations build out their client trust portals where they promote the certifications they get to help answer those questions, to make it more like that Amazon where you can kind of pick and choose the information that's already available, so that organizations don't have to go through the agonizing effort of completing these questionnaires as well. So
yeah, that whole self-curation thing, I think, is where a lot of companies are going, because to your point, they realize it's just much easier just to make it upfront and shareable, as opposed to very secretive and you can't get it, and then you just get asked and bothered all the time anyway. So
Sounds good. So one more thing for Jeremiah here, and then we'll pivot to John as well. But when it comes to vendors providing information or the level of information, I think, Jeremiah, you had mentioned something about fiber in the tunnel infrastructure related risks. How does an organization go about obtaining that level of detail from vendors? Because vendors don't usually provide infrastructure level detail in terms of the risks associated with that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. The review process needs to be relevant. It needs to be reasonable. You can ask for a million things. I once filled out a vendor questionnaire for a big bank. I won't say which one. And it had over 1,000 questions. And it's like, this has nothing to do with the services that we're trying to provide. And so I think it is important, while there needs to be standards and approaches, you have to have exception processes built into the process, so that you can go ahead and hey, they're not going to provide this. Okay, then that just becomes one thing that they don't provide. Take that analysis into the lens as you're doing your overall, initial risk scoring and your residual risk scoring as you're evaluating what they do. But we've seen where I can't provide that. Hey, can we do a screen sharing session? I just need to see some evidence that I just want to make sure we're verifying. You said you did it, but you're not going to share us a copy. Like, we need some level of evidence here. So there's different mechanisms. A screen sharing session tends to be a middle ground that we see oftentimes. But if not, you shouldn't have to ask for everything in the world. You're sitting there trying to get some level of assurance. So, and that level of assurance depends on the particular client and the vendor relationship and what the kind of services they're providing. But, have some reasonability is my recommendation there.
At the end of the day, don't be afraid to go on site. Right? I know post-COVID, that's kind of passe to go on site, but there is some great stuff that either maybe the vendor only shares information on site, to your point, either it's a screenshot of viewing it, or, learn some great things about the vendor that you can't see through a questionnaire or a tool or that sort of stuff. So
meeting in person is so important. I know we're all live in this virtual world. You're up in Buffalo. I'm here in Fairfax, and Near's in California. But there's so much can be learned. I do miss the days where you can a picture is worth 1,000 words. A tour is worth 1,000,000 words. It just
100%.
It paints such a picture. So,
but if you look at our backgrounds as an example, Anir, you and I all have virtual backgrounds on, right? And I like to use the example that sometimes that's the security questionnaire. That's the picture I paint for you. But if you turn off all of our backgrounds, I'm sure you would not. I don't have the MasterCard logo painted on my wall. And I'm sure you guys.
Oh no, I got the Tevora one. This is the wall. They
right.
They pay me to put this.
But oftentimes that's where you get to see, okay, what happens when I turn that background off? What does it really look like behind the scenes? Are they really as good as they say they are, or are they worse, or that sort of stuff? So yeah, I miss one of these days. I want to get together a bunch of people like you and I and just do a show that's nothing but war stories and horror stories from on-site assessments, because it might be the best attended viewer thing we ever have.
I thought about writing a book. I mean, the list gets so long. Yeah,
it's yes. I hear you. Someday.
The worst. I'm sure be violating a lot of confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure agreements in the process. So, anyway.
All right. So last question from the audience here, but a very good one, and resonating with a small team question that we had earlier. I have a very small team. Usually the team that manages vendor contracts for us manages vendors, and security often isn't involved. What tips do you have on encouraging cross-functional collaboration so both teams get involved in terms of assessing vendors?
Communication. One of the things that I would say is that when you're building programs or establishing programs, the importance of inside selling, and I say inside selling, it's selling to your partners, selling to your businesses. Once you've got some good metrics that are coming out of your programs, sharing those metrics with the appropriate business owners. Hey, did you know that in sales we had 42 vendors, and did you know that 3 of them are performing really badly? Just being able to, once you have the information, share the right information, share the relevant information, and communicate. To me, it's whether not it's adjacent teams, partner teams, communication is key into solving a lot of the problems. So I'd say, just open the conversation up. And sometimes there's folks that stonewall it, but usually you can escalate it up in the chain. But talk to people. In small companies, there's always someone who might throw you a monkey wrench. But do your best to communicate, share, and get a shared vision and shared goal, and help work towards understand their concerns and build. The Golden Bridge was that famous book, How to Win Friends, Influence People. Oh gosh. Anyway, have a shared vision, create that shared vision, and try to come to a mutual goal for the programs.
Yeah. So follow-up question on that. But
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So how do you handle the business people in units that don't play well, right? So not giving you all the information on a vendor and what they will be using. What questions can you ask in order to get all the information you need?
And that's why you have programmatic policies, charters that you're putting in place to say, hey, these are our expectations. And I, from the cybersecurity perspective, try not to be the Mr. No guy, but Mr. you should know KNOW so that you can go ahead and figure out, what risks are there with these particular vendors. And to the degree possible is to let the business own those risks, and saying, hey, I'm informing you. And at some point, someone's going to start making the right kind of decisions. Businesses take on risks. Let me tell you that. Working with organizations on third-party risks. Oh, the CEO said we have to use this vendor. It doesn't matter what they look like. We're going to use them. Okay, but run through the process. They failed everything. Oh my gosh. Well, if the business is willing to accept that risk, but at least you're doing some sort of risk transference within the organization. But at least having a thoughtful conversation. Hey, here are the risks with this entity. Think through this. This is my guidance as the practitioner within the organization to give you the guidance and to translate these details and what it means to the particular business. But the business can take on and sometimes takes on more risk than maybe us overly conservative cyber professionals would like to think they should. But businesses have their own risk tolerance, and we have to understand that.
Yeah, and I think the thing to keep in mind there too is, I've run into a situation where we had somebody who was going to accept that risk, right? Oh, I'll just accept the risk. That's how we always do it. And then we actually went back to the contract signing policy and said, hey, Mr. VP, you can sign a contract worth $5 million. Based on what this vendor does and the amount of data they have and the risks, if we don't do this assessment, we don't do whatever, could be as much as 40 million. Do you want to be in front of the board when something happens, when you say, well, why, hey, Bob, why'd you sign off on that? And you just said, because that's what we always do. No, you kind of, it's an education thing. I used to say as a practitioner and third-party risk leader that I was kind of 30% Inspector Clouseau or 33% Inspector Clouseau. I was trying to find out who my vendors were. I was 33% practitioner going out and doing the assessments, and I was 33% sales guy. I mentioned before, buying the coffees. I sat at countless numbers of business owners' desks, brought them coffee, talked them through things, and then you can kind of play on their bravado, right? Like, hey, we're finance is really good at what we're doing. Here's everything that, hey, by the way, you guys don't, you're way down here. You haven't done anything with regards to that. And there's that sense of competition, even amongst, the CFO and the CTO or the chief legal officer, their teams. They don't want to be the worst one when they have to go talk to the board. So you can kind of play on that and gamify things a little bit if you need to. Because at the end of the day, we're all competitive creatures, and we want to, we want ourselves or our boss or our business unit to look better than the ones that we're competing with for funds. So use that to your advantage. That's a great way to
John, you nailed it right there. The best metric there is a competitive analysis across the different businesses with the vendors and the vendor ratings. Boy, laggards don't want to be,
no, they don't.
So
they do not.
Huge. So if you can get your metrics to start doing business line metrics. So I'll close out with this. Business line metrics, if you get that level of maturity where you can say, hey, here's the vendor ecosystem maturity of sales versus finance versus HR versus IT versus legal, you can start to really get some good insights and great internal competition that will help move your program forward.
Amen to that.
All right. Fantastic.
Perfect. All right. Well, this kind of concludes our webinar here. So thank you to both of our panelists. Thank you for the great answers, great insight, and the expertise that you guys both bring to the table from different perspectives. Thank you to our audience members for being part of this webinar. Please feel free to reach out if there is any pending questions that you guys have that we weren't able to cover today. Yeah, thank you all.
Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.